So maybe you've heard of the Shapira Deuteronomy manuscripts. I'm going to assume very little knowledge, if that's okay with everybody. And if you have a lot more knowledge, just sit there and smile at yourself and check things off, as I go. I know that, I know that, and I know that. And if you don't know, then you'll learn. The question is, these texts, you see a drawing here. This is a facsimile. And that's important because when these were first published, people looked at those letters and thought, oh, I can do paleography on these and figure out if it's authentic or not. But this is an artist's, reproduction, not exact in any way, of just what they might have looked like, because we don't have them anymore, unfortunately. There's one photograph, and it looks just like the top color picture there, except it's totally dark, that you can't read a thing on it. It's a photograph. But we have hope to discover them again, to find them, to locate them. I'll talk about that at the end. It's pretty exciting. There's a whole team of us that have been working for a year on this, and we think they can still be recovered. And then that would solve so many things. So let me go ahead. If you have heard of them over the years, it would have been maybe Bar Magazine. Back in the 90s, there were articles. Herschel Shanks even did an article declaring them fake. You can look that up if you're a member of the Bar Library. If you're not, you should join because it's such a great deal. I even have my students join. So look at this, headlines. This was the international edition, but it came out first. But on March 10th of this year, in 2021, it was a top page, New York Times, "What if they were real?" I'll just read you the the headline. In 1883, 15 manuscript fragments, actually 16, we'll correct the times here, were found near the Dead Sea. Said to be a version of the book of Deuteronomy, they caused a sensation until they were denounced as forgeries and disappeared. Now a scholar is asking, what if they were real? Well, it actually turns out that two scholars were asking that, and I will explain that in just a minute. But that, when you get a headline like that in the New York Times, oh my goodness, it's unbelievable, the attention it gets and so forth. And so Shapira was relaunched all the way back from 1883. One quote I want to begin with from Moses Shapira, and I'll tell you who he is in a minute, the person who owned this document and brought it forth to European scholars in the summer of 1883. He says in one of his letters toward the end of the whole affair with it being judged as a forgery, in late August, he's actually leaving London in disappointment because it was not accepted by the scholars there. And I love this quote: "The sin of believing in a false document is not much greater than disbelieving the truth." Shapira, unless he's just a terrible liar, which some think he is and was, is lying here, makes a really good point that if this thing is true, by true I mean, is it a 19th century forgery or is it ancient? And if it's ancient, is it medieval? Is it from the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or is it even older? Is it maybe before the Second Temple period? So what happened? The one scholar that's featured in the Times is Idan Dershowitz. He teaches in Germany at the University of Potsdam, which is just in the Berlin area. And here is a wonderfully academic book by Idan that came out on March 10th, the day that the newspaper article appeared. That's called Good Publicity. If Idan's listening, congratulations. It was really well done. The other thing is you can get this book free. If you know more C-book books, they usually cost about $200. And you can get the entire book, public domain, academia.edu. Just go there, search for Idan Dershowitz's name as an author, and you'll find the book itself as well as other articles that I will refer to. However, unbeknownst to Idan, a book was published exactly 2 weeks later. March 10th was a Wednesday. And 2 weeks before, on February 24th, Ross Nichols, a colleague of mine, published a book called The Moses Scroll, much more popular book. So this is more the academic study of the Shapira scrolls. It's actually strips of leather, so we'll just call them scrolls. And Ross is much more of a, I would not popular as much as non-specialist, like the level of Bar Magazine. Both books are just marvelous. Ross's book is a page turner. He tells the whole Shapira story in such an engaging way that I just say you got to get this book if you're interested in the subject. And notice, forward by this guy, James Tabor. Indeed, he did ask me to read it and review it and read the forward, and I wrote the forward, and because I wanted to endorse it and I want it to have a wide circulation. You can get it on Amazon, or if you go to themosesscroll.com, he also has a blog. It's probably the most complete blog up to the minute on all the questions that are being asked, pro and con, much more than I can cover in this lecture. So that was quite a storm. February and March, Shapira is definitely launched again. And there has been so much since then going on. There's also an article, if you don't think you can wade through an entire academic book, also at academia.edu, search for Idan, and you'll find a journal article that came out the same day as well. And it's a summary of the arguments of the book. And I highly recommend you read that before you try to read the book, because the book is an academic book and gets pretty technical. Some of you can handle it just fine, but it's a wonderfully written article and summary of Idan's whole essential argument. And the amazing thing about Idan's work is we have new evidence that changes everything. And many of you might have read and heard of some of the publicity, but maybe you really not focused on this new evidence. And for me, it's getting close to a kind of a slam dunk in terms of this not being a 19th century forgery, certainly not a forgery by Shapira. And if it is by somebody else, we haven't been able to come up with anybody. The firestorm of news was everywhere. I just mentioned it on my blog, and you can see here at the bottom where it says stats. You know, some of you know my blog, jamestabor.com. I had 7,990 views just in a few days, which is pretty high. I mean, that's not high for TikTok or YouTube videos, I guess, but it's high for me. I usually get a couple thousand a day, and all of a sudden it was just like blowing up. All kinds of this is an article from Haaretz. Chris Rolston jumped in immediately. I think it was the day of or the day after the publication, and completely slammed it as a forgery. I think he'd read the article. I don't think he's read the book yet. He's continued to refine his position, although he still does hold that it's a forgery. So let me tell you about the man, Moses Shapira. He was born in 1830. This town, Kamenets-Podolsk, is in southwestern Ukraine today, probably would have been considered Poland in that time. His father in 1840, he would have been 10 years old, was one of those pioneers, a Jewish family, and very much Orthodox, very observant, and very much Hasidic. And listening to the prophecies of the day in Central Europe that the redemption was near and the Messiah is about to appear, based on some interpretations of several very major rabbis in Central Europe that are part of Hasidic Judaism, the date 1840 was predicted. So it's a date setting kind of thing. And so the father left for Palestine, as they called it then, the land of Israel, to meet the Messiah, basically, and to be a pioneer. Um, he never came back. He planned to come back and get his family and move them. We actually don't know for sure what happened to him, although we have some information. I want to mention this book. If you're interested in that messianic movement, you could just write this down or do a screenshot of it. It's by Ari Morgenstern, Hastening Redemption, the Messianism and the Resettlement of the Land of Israel. It's absolutely a wonderful book. And it shows you that it's not just Christian evangelicals who today support the Jews returning to Israel and building their state and fulfilling prophecy, probably for some questionable reasons, because they, of course, think that they're essentially out of favor with God without Jesus. But this is a movement that was very much a Jewish movement. And Moses followed his father's footsteps in the 1850s. On the way, however, he met some Christian missionaries who worked with Jews and tried to convince them that all those prophecies had failed and that he should believe in Jesus. So he became a kind of a Judeo-Christian. He went to Christ Church in the old city and settled. He worked with Conrad Schick. He also ran the bookstore there. I bet some of you stayed at Christ Church. You certainly know that wonderful coffee shop as you enter Jaffa Gate. And you know Conrad Schick. He married Rosette. She was a German nurse in 1861. He met her in the hospital. He became ill. They had two daughters, Augusta and Maria. This is the only picture we have of Moses Shapira. I love his face. I love the feeling here. Clearly, it's one of those posed pictures, but you can look into the face of this man and see something about Moses. Very quickly, he branched out and began to establish himself as an entrepreneur. He's very, very bright. He's good at languages. He begins to travel to the east into what is now Jordan and even into Yemen, and he begins to collect manuscripts and sell them to the British Museum. This sign he had over his shop on Christian Street, if you go into the old city, many of you know, and down the Shuk, this is one of the first streets on the left. And the back of the shop, you can see in the lower picture, has a balcony overlooking Hezekiah's pool. And so we can locate that shop today. It's still a shop. It's, of course, not his shop or anything to do with book selling. He liked to call himself a bookseller, but this is the time of Mark Twain. We're talking about the 1870s and 80s. A lot of the stuff he sold were, we would call them trinkets. And there's no doubt, as Shimon Gibson has shown in his book on 19th century Jerusalem, that a lot of the things that Shapira sold were forgeries. Forgeries were very common, whether he knew they were all forgeries or believed or not. But he mostly was interested in manuscripts and books, and he did sell hundreds and hundreds of very valuable manuscripts to various European museums, but particularly the British Museum. What happened in terms of the scrolls is that in the 1860s, some Bedouin tribes, now notice in this slide, you can see Qumran, you can see Jerusalem. Many of you have been to Jerusalem, you've been down to the Dead Sea, 15 to 18 miles south. You go to the lowest spot on earth. And over on the right side of the screen, you see Wadi Mujiv. It's the Arnon River in the Torah when Moses and the Israelites come into the eastern edge of the Dead Sea. And there are two towns here, Dibon and Auror, that we can locate. And you can see Auror is right on the side of the cliffs. And the cliffs are very, very steep and massive. And the Bedouin found in a cave way up at the top of the wadi, and it's a very treacherous wadi. It's very hard to hike, and it has flash floods and so forth. But they found these strips or these manuscripts. At least that's their account. In August of 1878, Shapira heard about the strips from the Bedouin, the Hajaja tribe, and some representatives in Jerusalem. He had a Bedouin associate that he was very close to, who arranged for him to buy them. He only paid just what we would call a few dollars. I think way under $50 equivalent back then. And there were 16 strips. It appeared to be a text of Deuteronomy, and there were 2 copies, identical copies. So that was interesting. They were wrapped up in linen, and they had this sticky stuff on them. And to open them up was very difficult. Does that remind you of anything from what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls? And in fact, the Bedouin threw them aside originally, and one enterprising member of the tribe picked up the glob of manuscripts. They thought they were maybe mummy wrappings or something, and he put them in his tent, and all of a sudden he started to prosper. I guess his wives began to have children, and all his animals were doing well, and people thought, oh, that thing is lucky. And but he still was willing to sell it. So Shapira read it. He had no idea what it was. He began to read it. He was very good at reading manuscripts. And in September of, I put 1978. Boy, I'm going to have to correct that. Would you guys not blame me for, I feel like correcting it now, but I won't. Actually, I'm going to, sorry. It'll just take a minute. I can't stand that. I can't stand to have a typo like that, because that's going to go in the video. 1878. Okay, is that good? Okay, so suddenly went to the modern 20th century. September 1878, he sent copies to a scholar he knew in Germany at the University of Halle, Schlottmann. And he said, I've come across this. I don't know what it is. We have that letter. And originally, Rolston and several people were saying, well, we don't know that he had the manuscripts that early. We have now discovered just about 2 months ago a copy of the letter. It's in the archives of the State of Israel. Believe it or not, the Schlottmann letter is there. I think probably Shapira's wife somehow got his stuff and donated it to the State of Israel. We think there's a lot more there too. We're just beginning to look. So we actually have that letter, and it's very enlightening because it's very clear that he has the manuscript. There's no question about it. And he's talking about this reading and that reading and discussing what it might mean. And Schlottmann is just livid. He's not excited at all. He says, this is just a cheap forgery. Get rid of it. Whatever it is, it's just trash, because it disagrees in its citing of the 10 Commandments. One of the things the scroll has is a different version of the 10 Commandments. It's very much closer to the Nash Papyrus, if you know the Nash Papyrus, which is a probably, certainly, I don't know exactly, people date it from 2nd, 3rd century BC on down. But Schlottmann was very pious, and he said, you cannot change our 10 Commandments. And Shapira was really chastised by that. He just thought, well, it's probably nothing. He put it away in a bank for 5 years, a bank vault, kept it. And then he came across Frederick Bleek's intro to the Old Testament that was just beginning to develop the critical theories of Torah scholarship, JEPD, and the sources of the Torah. And when he read Bleek's introduction, which some of us have now reread, he started noticing that the parts of his scroll that were considered some of the more valid parts were actually being vindicated by the critical scholars. So he had a couple of other people look at it in Jerusalem, including a Professor Paul Schroeder, who was a very, very qualified paleographer. And he encouraged, and others encouraged, Shapira to get it out again and try again, that he should not give up, that he should send it to scholars in Berlin. And so he said, forget Schlottmann for now. I'm going to go to Strock. This is some of you been to seminary, do you remember Strauch Billerbach? These are the books that we used in the old days, years ago. This is that Strauch. And he wrote this letter, and we have the letter. And to read the letter, I've read every bit of it. It's written in English, and you can find a lot of these materials on Ross Nichols' website, themosesscroll.com. He's transcribed these for people. You can actually read them. And he sends it to Strauch. And Strauch is not that convinced either that it's authentic, but he certainly thinks that it's fascinating. But at least we get Shapira presenting it very humbly in a way to Strauch. And then in 1883, in June, just the next month, he took it all to Europe, and he went to Hermann Goethe at Leipzig. And he decided to let Goethe actually look at it. Strauch was in Berlin. His daughter was going to school in Berlin, and he did visit Strauch. But as far as the fragments, he took it to Goethe. And there we have the German story. This is where it first landed in Europe. Hermann Goethe, here's a picture of him, Edward Meyer, George Ebers, and Adolf Ehrman all got really interested in it, and they worked together on it in Leipzig in July of 1883. Nichols, again, has published all the details of their letters and their encounters, and they were incredibly excited about it. This is what they saw when they laid it all out, is reconstructed by Nichols. The various copies, it's 16 strips in all. We think when Shapira took it on later to England that he kept one strip, and we think we know where that strip is. Because after this, we only hear of 15 strips, and we got an idea where that might be. I'm not going to tell anybody because I don't want you to go look. We want to find it. Anyway, they're at the Hotel Hofla in Leipzig, and they're working in Shapira's room. Goethe later publishes his report on the manuscript, and he ends up concluding, by the time he publishes it in September, by the time I'm getting ahead of the story, but everybody in the world had said it's a forgery, and he cautiously questions whether it might be a forgery. But in the early days, we now have the letters that are written back and forth between these four, and they are enthusiastically excited. And I want you to notice this. Meyer is my favorite. Meyer writes to Ebers, July 8th, the writing is wonderful. It stands between Misha, which is the stela we'll talk about, and Esmenazer, which is another text. It's different from the Shiloh scripts, that's the Pool of Shalom, and Shiloah, and with the shapes that the most skilled paleographer could not invent so beautifully and correctly. The orthography is very real. So these young guys are very excited about it, and they're jumping up and down, and we have the whole letter. Meyer also mentions another scroll that has come from east of the Jordan. It's a copy of Genesis, he mentions, that he's also gotten, and we're trying to trace that down because he says that he's sending a sample of it to Ebers. And so we haven't been able to find that yet, but it shows that there are scroll material coming from east of the Jordan, as you would expect, not just the west side. We tend to think, well, Qumran, it's on the west. It's very near Jericho, and the Romans, came down the 10th Legion and destroyed it, as we know. And then you go on down to Masada and so forth. But clearly refugees and others are sailing across or in boats across the Dead Sea, and other manuscripts are surely being hidden on the east side as well. That's during the Second Temple period, at least. This quote I particularly like. It's Ebers is older. He's the seasoned scholar, and he says to Meyer, Edward Meyer, the Moabitica are scarecrows which keep clever sparrows away from the good fruits, if there are such. Now that's kind of a little riddle, but the Moabitica were some fake images that Shapira had sold earlier. I don't think they're all fake, but certainly most of them are. I think there might be a few that are authentic, but he had a reputation then for, whether he knew it or not, passing along things that were later viewed to be fake. I'll show you pictures of some of those in a minute. But what Ebers is saying is be careful, because that's like scarecrows and you're clever sparrows and you're afraid to get down on the fruit. You might have something really real here. And he was very excited about it. We have a postcard from him. He travels. So Ross Nichols has reconstructed this whole history. Nobody else had ever done it. You've got to read the book. And it's very exciting. So when people say nobody accepted the Shapira scroll, it was just a joke, it was always thought to be a forgery. If you read Ross's book, you'll see that the story is much more complicated. I don't have time in this lecture to go into what happened when Shapira went to Berlin and met with Leipzig and the whole team, and they did not buy it. Well, they offered some money for it, but they still said they thought it was forged, but they wanted to own it as an example of how good a forgery could be. But anyway, you'll have to read further to learn all of that, because I want to move on. The Mesha Stela did offer some paleographic images of Archaic Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew. It was found in 1868, which would be close to the time that the Bedouin brought the scroll to Shapira. And one of the arguments of those who think it's a forgery is it's just simply somebody who knew the Mesha Stela playing around and deciding to forge a scroll. There are a whole lot of reasons that doesn't hold up, that Idan goes through very carefully in terms of paleography, special letters, other kinds of things. The Siloam inscription was not found until 1880, and it does have some interesting parallels in terms of paleography. Shapira then goes somewhat disappointed to London, where he's just wined and dined and feted, and David Christian Ginsburg is appointed by the government. Even Prime Minister Gladstone comes and looks at the manuscript, and Shapira is rumored to have asked $1 million, although £1 million, which would just be astronomical back in those days. You have to multiply by about 20, I think, to get the value. We actually now are questioning whether that's actually accurate. We have some good evidence that he never actually named a price, but there were all kinds of rumors going on. It was in the London Times almost every day. It was in the Athenaeum, which was a periodical. And Ginsburg was appointed to study it and decide whether it's a forgery or not. The great Christian David Ginsburg, also Jewish, also a convert to Christianity. Charles Clermont-Ganneau came from Paris, and he basically arrived saying, I want to see it, and I'll be able to show you that it's a forgery. He had already made up his mind. He really wasn't able to examine it. He did see it from a distance, and he decided that it was simply Shapira cut off the bottom of a Torah scroll and used that material to write the scroll, and that it's a forgery. I'll talk about some of the reasons as I go on. Gradually, everybody, it was like a wave, went with the forgery argument, and Shapira, even though I got all, here's a spread from the Scientific American to show you that it got to the United States. There are articles all over the world during 1883, the summer of 1883. And then as scholars began to say, well, it's a forgery, and finally Goethe with his book weighed in. By the way, that book of Goethe is free on academia.edu at Ross Nichols at his page. So you can actually read Goethe in English. It's been translated. Dave and Patty Tyler commissioned its translation. It's a beautiful translation. So you can actually read it in English. It's worth reading because everybody quotes Goethe and says, oh, he declared it a forgery. Well, you need to read it. It's much more complicated than that. And he does give the best history, and he also provides a transcript. Ginsburg also provided a transcript, but Shapira was simply shamed. He was made fun of as the Jew Shapira. Notice this caricature in Punch magazine, published in 1883 after he was supposedly exposed. You see Ginsburg you can see his hat there with his name on it. He's catching the crooked Jew and showing that he's a shyster and a charlatan and a Sherlock, even though Ginsburg's Jewish. And Shapira of course, was just devastated with this news. But contrary to what everybody says, he was not depressed or discouraged. He was disappointed. But we have letters from him that show that he was actually a letter from Amsterdam. This is after everyone had declared it's a forgery, not Goethe yet, but all the ones in England and everybody else was kind of piling on. And he writes Bond, and it's, I think, a 13-page letter. It's really worth reading because you see Shapira's personality. And he's discussing all kinds of details about it and readings, and it might mean this and that. And at the end, he says, I'm not willing to sell it to individuals, although I've had offers. He's at Amsterdam, we think, for the World's Fair that's being held there, and he's staying in the hotel there, and probably wanting to meet other scholars. We think he was planning to even go to the United States because people had expressed an interest in it. You remember when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found? Mar Samuel, the Syrian bishop, actually took them to Washington, D.C., and they did a tour, I think, of 17 different stops, including the Smithsonian. And he finally sold them. And I think Idan bought them surreptitiously so that nobody would know it was the Israelis buying them. But anyway, the state of Israel bought them. But back to the letter. This letter is witness to Shapira's state of mind. And there is a note Shapira wrote to Ginsburg where he says, "You've shamed me." And he says, "I don't know how I can survive this shame." And people say, "Oh, well, he's going to kill himself. Look at this." And it was even picked up by one of the papers, and he was kind of made fun of, that he's suicidal and, you know, he's been put down, and you saw the Punch cartoon. It was very cruel. But that's not the thing we get from Shapira's letters. We have letters from Shapira. We know that he traveled. He was in Holland, and he traveled in various places in Holland. He did end up in Rotterdam, which is the port, by the way, for the nonstop ships to America. I think that's why he's in Rotterdam. And he was found dead in his hotel room. Now, I'm not going to do some conspiracy theory here, but I do want to say that everybody says, "Oh, well, he wrote that note and then he went to Holland, who knows why, and then he killed himself." There's more to the story, and maybe we'll be able to figure it out. We're figuring out a lot. One of the medical reports says that he had 2 shots to the head, which I guess is possible in a suicide and known, but at least raises a question. There are other kinds of different disputed information about, was his body on the floor, on the bed? Was there a gun found or not? We've tried to collect all of the reports, and I can tell you that it's not certain. I guess robbery would be a possible motive if he was killed by someone else, thinking, "Oh, this is that guy that, you know, has that scroll and has other scrolls." By the way, he sold in 1884. In the end of 1883, he sold other manuscripts to the British Museum. He was still respected, and he has correspondence and letters back and forth. So this idea that he went and hit his head in the sand and blew his brains out is not the story that we're getting. Now, Shapira the forger. If you read my foreword to Nichols' book, you'll see that I start the book with this, and I say that when I went to graduate school and began to learn about the Dead Sea Scrolls and took courses in the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Oriel Institute, where Glenn got his PhD. I think I was earlier than him, but I studied with Golb and others, and read the Dead Sea Scrolls and studied them. All I ever heard was Shapira the forger. That's part of his name. He's not Moses Shapira. You mean Shapira the forger? They're usually talking about these Moabitica, they're called, these statuettes that were proven to be either all or mostly fake. This was an exhibit in the year 2000 at the Israel Museum in Shapira's house, where he used to live, the Tico house. You should go there in Jerusalem if you can, have tea there, and you'll be in Shapira's house where he lived. And notice it's called Truly Fake Moses William Shapira Master Forger. Slowly, the question began to be raised that are we jumping the gun on this? Miriam Harry, his daughter, wrote a novel in 1914. By the way, she was the first woman ever to receive the Grand Prix for literature in France because it had only gone to men. And they actually had to create another prize for women because you couldn't give it to a woman. Not for this novel, but another novel. She's an amazing writer. I have the book in French. I've translated it, also have it in English. You can get it in English from Amazon. It's a novel, but it's her growing up with her father, and the scroll is mentioned and all the things. And I really trust her account, even though it's a novel. Shulamit Lapid, if you know the name Lapid from the Prime Minister's office, believe me, this is his mother. She has a wonderful book out. It's in Hebrew and German. We hope it can come out in English. It's also a novel, 1984. And then Yoram Sabo, you can get this film if you go and Google it. Yoram Sabo, Shapira and I, it's on Vimeo and you can watch it. If you're going to get informed on Shapira, I would say, number one, watch this film. Number two, read Nichols' book. And number three, read Dershowitz's article. And number four, read Dershowitz's book. And then go to Dershowitz's Twitter feed and read all of the things back and forth that he's had with scholars since March. And you will be well prepared to dive into Shapira. Now, I know this is really small, but I wanted to show you a sequence here. Down below here, you have John Mark Allegro in 1965 publishes a book. And and I know everybody says, oh, Allegro, well, he's the mushroom guy and, he's kind of crazy. Well, this book is not crazy. And what he argues is we've dismissed this scroll too readily. One of the arguments was nothing like this could have survived for 2,000 years or more, and so it has to be a forgery. And Allegro's book is very important. The Times covered it. But even more important, Professor Mansour began to write about the scroll in 1956 and gave very good arguments for it to be reconsidered. It was considered at SBL meetings and talked about. This is the annual meeting of the SBL. And here's a report in the New York Times, which is pretty cool. And then here is Dershowitz's story. So here are just a few steps towards what I would call the reconsideration, if not the rehabilitation, of the authenticity of the Shapira scroll. Here's Mansour's conclusion. He concludes that neither the internal nor the external evidence supports the idea of a forgery, and that there's justification for re-examination. I think everybody would agree with that. Let's re-examine it. That was 1956. His article's available online. It's a PDF. Read it, and it is very dense. A lot of people brush over these early articles and say, well, that's all been disproven. It hasn't. Mansour's article is very strong. Allegro's book was 65. Look what Cyrus Gordon says. In brief, there's no longer any doubt that Shapira's parchments were genuine. The fate of the precious Shapira strips is a warning to us not to let negators, no matter how great their reputations, perpetuate irreparable damage. He was very upset. Some of you knew Cyrus Gordon. I knew him, talked to him several times, and he was just convinced that this was premature. Everybody decided, well, scrolls couldn't survive, therefore this. In fact, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, one of the arguments for their inauthenticity was, hey, remember the Shapira scroll? That was fake, so these could be fake. And I'll get to that in a minute. Bar Magazine, you can read the Bar version here in 1997 in the Bar Library, but 1995, he wrote a major article updating us all on the Shapira affair. And then Shlomo Gil, don't overlook this one. It's online. You can get it at academia.edu. If you go to Shlomo Gil's page, the Shapira scroll was an authentic Dead Sea Scroll. This has never been answered. It's a fabulous article. He deals with internal and external evidence, and it's very, very strong and very persuasive. The reasons people doubted it were the Moabite pottery scandal. like, hey, if those were fake, then this is probably fake. Such a manuscript should not survive, could not survive. It's cut from the bottom of a Torah scroll. Dershowitz has shown, and Shlomo Gil shows that that's not true. First of all, it's curved. I don't think anybody would cut a Torah scroll. You saw how it's curved. And even the early arguments against it make the edge straight. That the paleography shows signs of forgery. People, what do they know about the paleography? They're reading the drawings of artists that are facsimiles. It's not the actual paleography that they're seeing. We only have Gutha for that. And then the Hebrew content and syntax is questionable, which Dershowitz has thoroughly examined. Now, I want to point out that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, everybody thinks that they were accepted immediately. And I urge you to read this long article. I think it's 50 pages in the New Yorker. It's online. All this stuff I'm talking to you about today is online, except for Ross's book, I guess, but most of his book's online in terms of breaking down the arguments at his blog. Edmund Wilson, the famous New Yorker writer, he writes a comprehensive article in 1995 in the May 14th issue. Remember, May 14th is the birth of the state of Israel. So this is kind of significant that it came out that issue. And you got to read it because he shows about all the skepticism that people had about the Dead Sea Scrolls early on. So even though you can talk about Trevor and some of the things at the Albright where people were accepting it, and of course Yadin's father, Sukenik, accepted, but there was a lot of hesitation, and mainly the argument that how could things have survived? Now, let me just point out that when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have Paleo-Hebrew copies of Deuteronomy. If you look at 4Q45 and 4Q46, you can find these in various reference books. They're also online at the Hebrew University website. And you can see the Paleo-Hebrew here, and you can see just the style of it and how it hangs from the top of lines, and you can compare it to some of the facsimiles that at least give us some idea about the scroll. And so that's something that Idan has been doing and working on. He's the Hebrew Bible scholar. I'm more of an early Christian scholar, but I work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this is the huge discovery. Dershowitz discovered in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, we call them the purple pages, 3 pages of handwritten notes written by Shapira, probably around 1878. And they appear to be his initial, actually, I think after 1878, but before 1883, because he's reassessing the reading of the scrolls and he's trying to move things around. And does this word mean this? And does this column mean that? And Idan has read this very carefully. You can even see his notations, even mistakes that he made. These are not the notes of a forger. Now, I know Ralston and others have said, hey, Tabor, you're underestimating forgers. They create these fake things too to authenticate their manuscript. I'm sure they do, but that's not what this is. Anybody that's read it can see. You can also read the letter to Bond. You can read the letter to Strock, and to Schlotman. And so we have a Schlotman letter from 1878. And you've got to put all this together. And I can tell you, Shapira is not the forger. He's trying to figure it out. And Schlotman's letter was found now in the Israeli archives. I don't know if Nichols has put that up. It's in German, of course, and I'm not sure if we translate it. What happened to the scrolls? I've got to wind up here. Dr. Philip Brooks Mason ended up with them. If you read Reiner's article, 1997 bar, he thinks they might have burnt in a fire from a collector in Australia named Nichols. We now know that's not true, thank God. They did survive. And Dr. Phillips Brooks Mason, very famous. This is all covered in Nichols' book particularly. We know a lot about him. We've talked to his main biographer in England. I think Patricia Fitzgerald, I think is her name. I hope I'm remembering her name right. But anyway, it's all in the books that I'm talking about. He was a physician, a great collector. He corresponded with Darwin. He was a naturalist, also a doctor. Burton-on-Trent in England. Some of you know that town, maybe you've been there. And he owned the scrolls, and the last time they were seen was March 8th, 1889, at a Masonic hall, where here's the article that we've now discovered. And this was discovered by, I think, Sabo, who does the film. And if you watch his film, you'll see him actually discovering this and the excitement. You got to watch his film. It's so exciting. And Brooks Mason displayed them. He died in 1903. So our trail goes cold in 1903, but at least we know they survived, and they were bought for a very small price from a book dealer, Quarish in London, who bought them from when they were auctioned off, very possibly by Rosette, the wife who would have owned them after Shapira's death. Now, before I end, it's time for me to end, and I want to leave you with some questions. Please notice this slide, because Idan has a lecture online. It's an hour long. It is 10 times better than anything I've given. So this is almost a lecture leading up to this lecture. And if you go to hillel.harvard.edu, which you can easily remember or jot down, hillel.harvard.edu, just pick video presentations, lectures, and scroll down, you'll find this lecture. It's on Vimeo. You can watch it free of charge. And it is just fabulous. And you'll get a little bit about Idan's personality. Also, it has Q&A at the end, just like we're going to have in a minute. So please check that out. And subscribe to Bar if you haven't already. I'm sure all of you do. Buy some more subscriptions for your friends, because look what's coming in the winter. I think maybe November. The case for authenticity. Dershowitz and I have written this article. I cover the scrolls. He covers the texts themselves. And then it's also going to be countered by two scholars who give the other side. So it's going to be great to go through these things. Last slide, read the scroll. Did you notice I didn't tell you what was in it? That was purposeful. I could have begun to tell you. Ross Nichols' The Moses Scroll has a translation and a transcription. And I think he might even have it up on his website. Not that you shouldn't buy the book. Idan Dershowitz, Valediction of Moses. This is his book. He also, you can get it online, academia.edu. And he also has a transcription and a translation put back into Paleo-Hebrew and translated. You got to read it. It's pretty amazing. I don't even want to tell you what's in it, because I want you all to read it and, read the book. And then we can discuss all the other technical questions. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop the share.